I rise to speak about the effect of interchange fee reform on small banks and credit unions. Interchange fees are not well known by most Americans. They're known as swipe fees or interchange fees, and they reflect the amount of money that is paid to a bank each time you use that bank's credit or debit card. You don't know it as a consumer that you're being charged extra when you buy something at a store if you use plastic, but that fee is being paid to the bank every time you swipe the card. Who establishes that fee? Well, you would assume that the bank does, but it's not so. The fee that is charged every time you swipe a card is established by the credit card companies. The big giants, Visa and MasterCard, decide exactly how much that fee will be. And you ask yourself, well then, what voice does a merchant or retailer have in how much that fee is going to be on each transaction? And the answer is virtually no voice. It is a price-fixing mechanism where Visa and MasterCard and the major credit card companies establish the interchange or swipe fee to be paid to each bank, credit union, or financial institution that issues the credit or debit card. It's a lot of money. Each month in America, just on debit cards now, each month in America, they collect about $1.3 billion in transactions where people use debit cards. Now remember, a debit card is like your checking account. You're drawing money directly out of your checking account to pay the merchant where you're doing business. It isn't like a credit card, where in fact they have to collect the money from you later on. This is a situation where the money is taken directly out of your bank account. And you would think, as with the use of checks in the old economy, that this would be a low-cost transaction, and it should be. It used to be banks would process checks written to pay a restaurant or a department store, charging pennies on the transaction, not a percentage of the transaction. Well, the Federal Reserve took a look at what's being charged for debit cards, where the money comes right out of your account. Turns out the average is about 40 cents a transaction. We asked them, well, what is the reasonable amount that should be charged if you're going to take into account exactly how much it costs a bank to process a debit card transaction? They said it was closer to 10 cents or 12 cents. So merchants and retailers across America on every single transaction involving a debit card are paying an inflated amount of swipe fee or interchange fee. And most of those fees go to the largest banks in America. You see, almost 60% of all the debit card transactions really focus on three major banks. I want retailers and merchants to be treated fairly. Incidentally, for the record, what is the debit card interchange fee charged by Visa and MasterCard issuing banks in Canada? It's zero. Zero. There is no interchange fee in Canada because the government there said, we're not going to stand for this. You're really ripping off merchants, retailers, and consumers. We won't let you do it. Same thing happened in Europe, where they brought down the interchange fees to dramatically low levels. Well, in the United States, the battle's on. And if you had to pick a group with the lowest level of credibility when it comes to this institution or Congress, maybe even the American people, I guess next to politicians, you'd have to say big banks, particularly the big banks that were bailed out by our federal government when they made a mess of things a few years back. So the big banks that issue the debit cards can't come in here and lobby for themselves. The credit card companies themselves don't enjoy a very good reputation here either. Consumers know what a tough time it is to pay those bills off and the fine print that they have to deal with in their contracts. So what these groups have done, the credit card companies and big banks, is to enlist small banks and credit unions to come and appeal to us, saying we're in your city and community and the Durbin Amendment can hurt us. What they don't say is that the law that we passed specifically exempts all banks and credit unions with a valuation of lower than $10 billion. $10 billion. So of the 7,000 or 8,000 credit unions in America, how many have a valuation over $10 billion? 3. How many banks out of the 7,000 or 8,000 have a valuation over $10 billion? Less than 100. So we're talking about 100 institutions here who will be affected by this law, and the others are exempt. I respect their right to speculate on what might happen when reform takes place, but in response, I point out that they simply have not provided any evidence to back up their claims. In fact, all the hard evidence about the interchange systems leads to the opposite conclusion. Interchange reform will give small banks and credit unions competitive advantages against the bigger banks. This isn't just my conclusion. It's a conclusion of a prominent economist and industry analyst like Andrew Carr, whose Frontline program profiled as the creators of the modern card industry, plastic card industry. And former IMF chief economist Simon Johnson, in a recent online survey, even 60% of American bankers' subscription-paying readers agreed that interchange reform will help small banks. So the members who come to the floor and say, oh, this terrible rule change that exempts banks with less than $10 billion in assets is going to hurt them, they're not only wrong on the facts, they're wrong in public opinion. The key point to remember here is that the debit interchange system isn't a properly functioning market. The interchange system has been designed in a way so normal market forces don't apply. No transparency, no competition. Last year, a bipartisan majority of my colleagues recognized that reform needed to take place. And after years of studies and hearings, it became clear the interchange system was not going to cure itself. It was broken and unfair. This broken system would not survive were it not for the fact that Visa and MasterCard represent a combined 90% of the debit market. Merchants are powerless to negotiate and can't take their business elsewhere, so they're left with no choice but to pay these fees. In short, interchange is an abnormal market which has no naturally occurring market force to hold fees in check. Visa and MasterCard want as many of their debit cards to be swiped as possible. That's how they make their money. By raising interchange rates that merchants must pay to banks, the card companies entice banks to issue more cards. Merchants can't refuse Visa and MasterCard. They can't negotiate them with, so they're stuck with what they have to pay. Last year, Congress decided that we no longer simply trust Visa and MasterCard to fix interchange fees however they want. We passed a law that said when Visa and MasterCard fix fee rates on behalf of banks with over $10 billion in assets, the rates, according to the Federal Reserve, must be reasonable and proportional to the amount it actually costs the banks to process the transaction. But we specifically exempted community banks and credit unions with valuations below $10 billion, believing that those community banks deserve a break and a helping hand. They're not showing much gratitude for that exemption. The American Bankers Association has claimed that if big bank debit fees are reduced, merchants will discriminate and find some way to get customers to use big bank debit cards instead of small issuer cards. If this claim were true, we would surely see some evidence of it today because of multi-tier pricing in credit card interchange. Let me give you an example. For supermarkets, a Visa credit card with no rewards program currently carries an interchange fee of 1.15%, more than 1% of what you purchase. That's the interchange fee if it's a simple Visa credit card, no rewards. But a Visa Signature Preferred Rewards credit card has an interchange fee of almost twice that, 2.1%. By the ABA's logic, supermarkets right now would be discriminating against rewards cards and steering customers to non-rewards cards. No evidence of that discrimination anywhere. I challenge the American Bankers Association, put up or shut up. If you've got some evidence to the contrary, let's see it. If you don't, retract the specious claim. Why don't merchants discriminate? The merchant community sent me a letter a few weeks ago explaining in detail how they lack the contractual authority to do it, the practical ability, and the economic incentive to discriminate. I also want to add a common sense point. Most Americans only have one debit card. If a merchant tells a customer not to use his debit card because it was issued by a small bank, the customer would likely do one of two things: not make the purchase at all, or pay with a credit card. Credit cards carry much higher interchange fees than debit cards. How then would discriminating against debit cards be in a merchant's interest? And I want to tell you, when I talk to the merchants, I've got Wendy Cronister, who runs a series or a whole slew of gas stations in Central Illinois, took the business over from her dad. She's a great young woman, executive, and she said, "Senator, they put the plastic on the counter, we take it. If it clears, we've got the transaction, move on to the next customer. We are not going to debate how many other credit cards you're carrying and where's the one with the lower interchange fee. We don't have time for it, and we're not going to put that kind of hassle on our customers. The American Banking Association, Bankers Association, and the National Credit Union Association, now marching in lockstep on issues, are going to oppose any reform. The entire financial industry is making a killing under the current interchange system to the tune of $1.3 billion a month. Do the math and figure out why this has every lobbyist in town working to defeat the Durbin Amendment. 30 times 1.3. That's pretty close to $40 billion that's at stake here if the amendment to stop this Durbin change in the interchange fee system goes through. Well, the change needs to go through. There's widespread consensus that we need to reform interchange system to rein in Visa, MasterCards, and the biggest banks on Wall Street. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. In fact, I've seen polling across this country in every state from virtually every political group, left, right, and center, where they overwhelmingly support interchange fee reform. I think we took care of those small issuers in last year's law. If they've got some suggestions on how to give them more assurance that Visa and MasterCard won't set rates at unsustainable levels, I'm listening. But make no mistake, I will not support any delay or repeal of the overall interchange rulemaking because this will let the big banks and card networks off the hook. We are very close to finally reining in the abusive interchange system and providing help to consumers and merchants. We can't let the big banks and card companies avoid accountability yet again. They already get away with too much. Closing, I strongly believe we need interchange reform. We need to bring fairness, competition, and transparency to a broken debit system. I'll work hard to make sure this reform happens and happens soon.